So it's with great pleasure to have Nojang Khatami, a very good and old friend of mine. And I'm sure many of you know him and his work and publications. So I'm just going to give a very brief bio of Nojang from his academia. So he has got a BA in English Philosophy Spanish from University of Toronto, MA in Political Science from UBC. He finished his Ph.D. in Political Science from UBC as well, and he's a postdoc now in an institute in Germany that he just pronounced, but I leave him to introduce himself a little bit more. And as you have seen the topic of his presentation, it's a very exciting, very interdisciplinary topic. So Nojang, welcome to Flybatel. Our group has been pioneer and a group to bring together Iranian scholars of humanities and social sciences in the past 3 years, and we are really glad to have you today. So floor is yours.
Thanks so much. خیلی متشکرم و thanks to everyone for tuning in and being a part of this. Really been looking forward to giving this talk and having this conversation with this group. As I've presented my work in different venues recently, but it's especially nice to be able to share with you all and to have an opportunity to hear your thoughts on some of the particularities of what I'm going to talk about today, including, of course, the main sort of subject of it, which is about Hafez and the ways that his ideas can be and are received in different ways across time and place. So if it's possible for me to bring up my slides, I just would need to be a co-host to be able to do that.
You can share now.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Okay. Great. So the topic and the title of this talk, which is a part of the research that I've been pursuing over the past year, it's titled Travel in the Poetics of Dissent, Migrations of Hafez through Iran and the West. And so this, just to sort of situate it as part of my research that I've been pursuing within political theory, a lot of my work is at the intersection of aesthetics and democratic theory and sort of the history of political thought more widely. And within and at this sort of intersection, there's of course a lot that has been written and continues to be written in Western academia about aesthetics in relation to politics. But as I'm sort of pursuing these ideas in this this field that is called comparative political theory, the idea is to try to consider some context outside of the West and to think about how different thinkers, writers, and in this case, a poet like Hafez can give us something to understand and to apply to different political contexts. And so in this vein, in choosing the subject of Hafez and the potential political uses of his poetry, one thing I really want to highlight and would say that is important in asking this question of what might some of these applications be is having this kind of attunement to what poems like those of Hafez can mean to different people across time and place. And so this is why in this presentation, I'm going to largely relate Hafez's ideas to, for instance, other thinkers and poets like Goethe, for instance, in 19th century Germany, And then a very important figure in the American literary tradition and the American philosophical tradition of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then to bring it back to the so-called point of origin, if we want to call it that, back to Iran, and to think about some contemporary uses and possible uses of Hafez's poetry in a political context. And like I said, I'll be especially, curious and would love to hear thoughts of others about some of these possible applications. So the first part of the presentation is largely going to consider some of the impediments, the challenges that arise to understanding and to immersion in texts like those of Hafez. And I'm also going to lay out some of the important sort of methodological points in bridging different approaches that can give us some tools that I think are helpful for approaching a subject like this. So the first of these, again, working within comparative political theory, the first cue that I would take here, and that I think this is really important work that has been done recently by theorists like Adam Getachew and Karuna Mantena, they put forward this idea about the importance of contextual attunement. That is, so this is a fairly recent essay or article in which they argue that if we want to understand ideas outside the so-called Western tradition, it's important to try to accept them as far as possible on their own terms and to understand the context that they came from. Because quite often what can happen is we may end up reading ideas from outside of the West through a kind of Western lens because of the sort of the philosophical tradition and all of this baggage that we may be sort of bringing with us when we make this kind of approach. And so that's why scholars like this would maintain that it's important to also think about the possible positive contributions that non-Western thinkers and in this case poets can make and that they can contribute and that they can give us to understand. Alongside this, and this is sort of in the background of my approach as well, are the sort of dual approach of hermeneutics alongside phenomenology. So on the one hand, hermeneutics, of course, attunes us to the necessity of attending to the potential prejudices that we may carry when we're approaching a text or when we are approaching a set of ideas or words or speech. Anything that is sort of being given to us to understand, we're always already receiving it with certain ideas in the back of our minds. And so the sort of the hermeneutical process is really all about how we come to understand something based on our prior experiences. Also, because we're considering poetry in this case, the phenomenological aspects of it are also important because poetry, as I'll go on to show or talk about with regard to Hafez, is also very much an embodied experience. It's not something just that you just sort of read on a page. I mean, that is one way. You might just kind of look at poetry in the sort of textual form. But poetry also has a tendency to become sort of internalized. For instance, when you memorize it, when you recite it, it has this kind of embodied perspective as well. And so in that sense, I would highlight these approaches in philosophy as significant, important points of departure for approaching a poet like Hafez. And the third one, which I'll actually say a little bit more about because it's, I think, especially useful for when we're thinking about how an idea may travel and may be received in different ways across time and place. The theory that is provided by Edward Said on this is, I think, especially germane and useful for this kind of task. So just to give an overview of what Said provides us with actually 2 essays that he wrote. The first one in The World, the Text, and the Critic back in 1983. And then he also has a follow-up essay called Traveling Theory Revisited, which he wrote several years later. But basically in both of these essays, Said was exploring the idea of, this sort of essential notion of what happens when an idea or a theory travels from one place to another. What kind of changes does it possibly become sort of exposed to, and how does it possibly transform? So Said identifies several stages that I think are useful to think about when we're approaching a set of texts and ideas that may travel. So originally, he says, there's a so-called point of origin. There are the initial circumstances from which a set of ideas or theory may spring. So it's sort of where the ideas sort of come out and are put into the world in the sort of milieu of that original sort of setting. Then Said notes and goes through the several stages through which an idea may travel, and of course highlighting the changes that it can undergo and that it inevitably does undergo through these various points of movement. So he then talks about the distance traversed. And what's really, I think, useful in the way that he identifies this process is that he considers both the temporal and the spatial dimension. That is, an idea coming from one context to another can be physically transported in a sense, right? So it can move in the form of books or even persons when they embody certain ideas and they take it with them. So that's one way in which an idea travels kind of physically in a sense. And then, of course, there's the passage of time. So ideas or theories can be said to travel also across time. So Said considers both of these, and he really highlights the pressure that is involved in that sort of movement. So he says the distance traversed is about a passage through the pressure of various contexts as the idea moves from one place to another. So the reason he places a lot of emphasis on this is that through this kind of movement, naturally, an idea is going to be taken in very different ways, right? It's not just going to remain pure. It's not going to remain the same. It's inevitably going to face a kind of confrontation, as Said calls it. So a process of acceptances and resistances. So, parts of an idea or a theory may be accepted on certain terms. Other aspects of it may be resisted. And what ends up coming out of this process is what Said calls accommodation. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the idea simply, moves from one place to another and, is accommodated in the sense that it is accepted like in its original form. Rather, as Said is really at pains to point out, it undergoes a transformation, right? So through that whole process of the distance traversed and the confrontation of ideas, in some cases, the ideas may end up looking very different from what they were at the so-called point of origin or departure. And so I won't spend too much more time on this because, of course, we want to get to Hafez and how his ideas are received. But just to say briefly that, Said furnishes some examples of this. He talks, for instance, about George Lukács and one of his students, Lucien Goldman, and how moving across time and taking these ideas can give a very different shape to them. Essentially, ideas can become quite different through this kind of movement. So that's the real sort of crucial point to highlight with traveling theory. Now, when it comes to Hafez himself, I'm sure that with this group, I will likely not have to say as much about this part because Hafez is in many ways familiar to many of us. He's sort of in the background in many ways for those that sort of grown up with his poetry. And so despite that, I think it is worthwhile and important to remember the sort of context in which Hafez's poetry actually came to be composed. And this can, I think, maybe help attune us to the potential political significance of what he has left us with. So we know, of course, that in the 14th century in Shiraz, this poet by the name of Hafez, who some aspects of his his biography have remained kind of mysterious. But there are, of course, some very important facts that we do know about his life, which is that he initially lived under a relatively tolerant regime. So there was one of the rulers there, Abu Ishaq, and so he was able to live as a court poet and to produce all of these poems about love and music and all of the things that and wine drinking and the things that he is known for. But there's a significant turn, and this is, I think, helpful in trying to locate and to try to appreciate the possible political significance of his work, which is that before long he was living under a much more tyrannical regime. So after that sort of period where he was able to write more with more freedom and liberty in what he wanted to produce, there was a period where that became interrupted. So for approximately 5 years, based on what we know, he then came to live under a much more tyrannical regime. And it's really that part that I want to highlight in talking about the political significance of his poems. Again, of course, we know that even though he has this somewhat, not a vague relationship, but a kind of, somewhat difficult relationship with the Sufi tradition. He doesn't always fit so neatly within that, because what he does with his poetry sometimes, goes even farther than, Sufi poets before him. But of course, what he shares in common with that tradition is the symbolism of wine drinking and love, and all of these ideas, which you also, of course, find in the other really prominent representative of Maulana. And so the really, I think, decisive turn in Hafez's writing, though, and what we can maybe identify as being one of the most significant sort of political aspects of his work, is that many of his ghazals in his divan were composed during a period of political turmoil, right? So as you know that, there were these, the Mongol invasions had already been happening for several years. And Shiraz was a city that was often besieged by certain warlords, and there was a lot of sort of vying for political power. And in Hafez's lifetime, actually, from what we know, political power actually changed something like 8 times during that period of his lifetime. And again, one of the really significant ones was during the reign of this one warlord named Mubarak ad-Din, who in 1353 came to take over Shiraz, and very notoriously really overturned a lot of the sort of liberal, tolerant sort of norms that had been prevalent in the city. And this included, closing the taverns, placing these bans on wine and music, and of course, all of the things that Hafez and his sort of like-minded companions had loved and had been writing and, singing about. So it's in this context that we can say that part of Hafez's work came to be sort of informed by and became responsive to these kinds of political events. The other thing that I think, as we know about Persian poetry, is that there's an aspect of course, when we talk about like adab and adabiyat, there's an aspect of ethics that is, of course, involved in this. The sort of, upbringing that is involved in reading and reciting poetry and going back to it. This is, of course, very sort of central, right, in the Iranian imaginary. In addition to that, there's the aspect of enjoyment that comes along with, reciting and reproducing these poems and keeping them as a part of life. And then there's, this is what I sort of identify as the sort of less commonly appreciated aspect of poetry like that of Hafez, which is that there's this element of resistance that is very much central to it as well. To the point that I think, we can say that a poet like Hafez, he wasn't just writing for edification and enjoyment, but that he was writing as a kind of dissident. And that's why I, identify these, the political context and the sort of circumstances of the time as being really crucial to that aspect of his poetry. The other thing, last thing before maybe we consider one of his poems together, is that of course, many of the works of poetry were preserved in a certain form, right? And I think many of us have seen manuscripts like this. This is actually, a very old one. I think this one is from the 15th century. This is from the Masnavi of Maulana. And as we know, these kinds of manuscripts, when they preserved poetry in this kind of way, it was also a kind of aesthetic experience, right? So aside from being a work of art that you memorize and recite and internalize, there's this kind of this aspect of representation that quite often accompanies that in the form of like a physical work of art. And so, of course, the calligraphy of Nastali and the style of that, the adornments, all the work that goes into making a book of poetry during those centuries, and especially in the centuries that came after Hafez, this was part and parcel of the sort of aesthetic experience that is involved in, disseminating the poems. The other thing, and I'll just sort of mention this briefly, and just to let you all know, like the next couple of pictures are going to include depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. So these kinds of images, which often accompanied as miniature paintings. So this is from Khamse Nizami. And so, for instance, there were these, you find in these kinds of manuscripts, these kinds of scenes which may be considered by some approaches to, Islam and what is supposed to be Islamic when it comes to what is acceptable as representation and so on. Quite often, these kinds of scenes that accompanied works of poetry, they would be pushing against the boundaries of what is considered acceptable, right? One way of putting it is, for instance, like as Jacques Rancière talks about the notion of the distribution of the sensible and like what is considered acceptable in terms of, representation and appearance and so on. We might say that these works of poetry were also intervening in what is considered acceptable according to, the authorities and again, certain interpretations of Islam. So that's all, I would say, an important part of it to take into account, how poetry was doing many of these different kinds of things. But last but not least, again, as we all know, when it comes to the sort of Persianate imaginary, and going really far back in our history, there's always been this sort of love of gardens, right, and of the environment of the garden and what it represents, this possibility of trying to create a kind of paradise on earth, and all of the things that come with that, right? Music and wine and so on, and like good company, good conversation. So as shown, for instance, like in Saadi's work, like in Golestan, in these kinds of works, you know, it's a kind of celebration of that way of life, right? And so Hafez's poetry, and just to again bring it back into situate it, I would say very much falls into that kind of you know, those notions of trying to, you know, recreate a kind of paradise on earth. And this is, of course, with the backdrop of, you know, him living in a city like Shiraz, which has been for so long sort of famed for its gardens and all of the things that are associated with Shiraz. So it's in the backdrop of all this that when he produced poems like these, so this is, I'm just going to give one example of one of his ghazals from his divan. And this is, by the way, and again, I'll be sort of curious to hear what you all think of the different possible interpretations that can come out of this. But this is, I think, one of his most representative kind of poems, where there is a distinctly political dimension to what he's saying, given that, again, it was written at a time when, you know, the authorities had essentially, you know, outlawed or tried to ban wine and poetry and music and all of these things. And so it's in the background of all this that Hafez, you know, defends the sort of rendi lifestyle, right? So he is directly addressing the so-called ascetics, right? The kinds of preachers who would insist on living like a pure sort of lifestyle and like avoiding the pleasures of life and so on. And towards them, he directs words like these. He says, "Don't go finding faults with rendis, you pure pious preachers, for their sins don't need to be linked with your name." And then he'll come out and say things like, "Don't worry whether I'm good or bad, go work on who you are. Each one of us weaves his own fortune with work and practice." And then again, these sort of gestures toward a kind of tolerance, dialogue among religions. He says, "Each one of us searches for the beloved, whether drunk or sober, and each place is a house of love, whether mosque or synagogue." And then finally, you know, with that expression of sada taslim, right, which is, of course, directly engaging in conversation with these understandings, these interpretations of Islam, he subverts that and says, you know, my head is bowed in worship at the wine shop store, right, at the tavern. And these pretenders to knowledge, which again, he's referring to the religious and the political authorities, these pretenders to knowledge don't understand a thing about it. So there are, of course, these elements in Hafez's poetry, and, you know, there's tons of other examples, which, by the way, in the Q&A, I do have a series of other examples that I can maybe also bring up and get your thoughts on. But, you know, this is sort of ubiquitous in Hafez's poetry, and it's very common for him to say things like this in many parts of his divan. And so it's with all of this in mind that I really want to highlight the possible political dimensions of his poetry. So I'll come back to that when I relate it to different ways that his poems may be and continue to be received in contemporary Iran, and to relate it to some of the recent events and the protests that have been now happening for months. But to take this kind of detour through the experiences and the exposure of Hafez's ideas to Goethe and Emmerson. So coming back to this question of what might happen to ideas when they travel to a very different time and place and become used in new circumstances. So going, all the way from Shiraz in the 14th century to a place like Weimar in Germany in the 19th century, naturally there's a big gap there, right? There's going back to that notion of the distance traversed that Said talks about, there's a vast distance there, right? Both spatially and temporally. And so this is going to bring up the myriad challenges that are going to be involved in possibly, trying to appreciate the context and the nuance. So when someone like Goethe encounters Hafez's ideas and his poems, and what's really remarkable is that when he does, he feels this real sense of affinity with him, this kind of closeness to Hafez, which I think is maybe unlike any other interpreter in the West ever, because Goethe, of course, goes on to write his entire East-Western Divan, which is this massive tome of poetry that is, of course, inspired by Hafez. And so how is it that Goethe comes to have that kind of, excitement and enthusiasm in writing about a poet who is coming from a very different time and place? Just a quick word about how these poems actually reach Goethe. So, as we might know, there were a lot of travelers from Europe going to Iran over several centuries, right? So from Italy, for example, there were travelers like Pietro della Valle. There was Jean Chardin, who was probably, one of the best known and maybe kind of infamous travelers, and to Iran. And many of these travelers would bring back certain accounts and travelogues of their experiences in Iran in order to tell Europeans, like, this is how they're living over there. These are some of their ideas and so on. But the most significant one in the case of Goethe was this translator, then in his own way, he was also a kind of poet by the name of Joseph von Hammer, who at the turn of the 19th century, so in the late 1700s, early 1800s, he ended up bringing back with him this much deeper sort of experience and involvement in Hafez's writings. And he ended up becoming the first person to try to actually translate the entirety of Hafez's Divan into German. And interestingly, though, when he did that, he didn't have access to the original Farsi. He based his translation on an existing Turkish translation. So there's, again, all kinds of complexities involved in that. And if you were to look at it, there are a lot of possible problems with the interpretation. And yet, despite all of that, when these poems when Hafez's Divan actually reaches Goethe in this way, and in German, which he's able to read, Goethe again has so much like exuberance and excitement over the fact that he feels that he has found someone who is just like him. As he goes on to say in his poems in his East-Western Divan, he starts to consider Hafez his twin, as he says, that this is sort of like his double. This is someone that he shares so many affinities with that he practically comes to see himself as sort of at one with Hafez. And so if you've had a chance to look at any of the poems from Goethe's text, you'll of course see that he goes as far as imitating Hafez, speaking directly to Hafez, and so on. And again, we can kind of look at some examples of that in the Q&A as well to see just how he does this. But at the same time, we can note that certain things kind of get lost through these different sort of translations. So for instance, in many different parts of Goethe's text, he refers sometimes quite directly to Hafez and his ideas, but sometimes he mixes Hafez's ideas with, for instance, those of Saadi or others. And this is in part, of course, not just because of the imperfect translations that he was working with, but also because when he comes across these ideas, a lot of them are fairly new to him. And of course, Goethe has never been to Iran and has never had this kind of like more direct immersion or experience. So he's just working with the texts that are available to him, right? And so this naturally leads to certain gaps in his understanding and in the depth of the appreciation that he may have had about this. Despite that, if we were to compare that to the kind of reception of Hafez by Emmerson, Goethe's is still really astonishing, just given the fact that he's able to capture the spirit and the essence of Hafez's poetry much more closely. With Emerson, it's a different case, because if you were to look at some of Emerson's interpretations and uses of Hafez, in his case, he's bringing maybe a lot more baggage, we might say, into the experience, into the encounter. And when he brings certain notions of self-reliance, his sort of development of these ideas that came to be known as transcendentalism, and especially his thoughts on fate, this becomes fairly troubling, I think, when Emerson approaches Hafez, because Emerson has this tendency, and you can see this in many of his essays as well. He wrote this what came to be a very widespread and well-known essay called Persian Poetry. And in texts like these, he tended to identify poets like Hafez, but also, thinkers and writers from the East, and practically everyone from the so-called Orient, as being sort of fatalistic, as having this kind of tendency to just sort of accept things for what they are and not really try to change the world around them. And this sort of deterministic worldview that he ascribed to practically everyone in the so-called East or in the Orient becomes a really sort of troubling aspect, including in his interpretation of Hafez. So that if you were to look at some of the things that he says about Hafez and about other poets, other Persian poets in particular, you see that it is very much, tinged with this kind of perspective, and it's colored by his perceptions of what people over there are supposed to be like. So these are just two sort of interpretations of Hafez that emerge. These are among the best known ones, right? And of course, a lot has already been written about this, and we can of course still debate the accuracy, or how close these interpreters actually come to really deeply appreciating Hafez and the message in his poems and so on. And so we can come back to talk more about that, of course. But in the interest of time, I just want to go back to and end on this point about some of the things that can be done and that I would say are being done with ideas and poems and themes like those of Hafez. So for this last part, I'll be referring largely to sort of these ethnographic studies that have been carried out recently by this amazing scholar by the name of Nilüfer Hayari, whose work you may have read, but if you haven't, I do highly recommend it. It's a great book. So in this book called Say What Your Longing Heart Desires, which is about women and poetry in Iran, she interviews a large group of women in Iran who are part of poetry circles. So that so they get together, they read poetry together, they recite it, and of course it's not just for instance classical poets like Rumi and Hafez, but they also read more 20th century poets like Parvin Etesami, Furugh Farrokhzad, and others. And when they read these poems together, as Hari points out, this experience is, it allows them to question the status quo around them. So that there are numerous dimensions that she points out in terms of what it allows them to do, in not only in their self-understanding, but this understanding of relationality between themselves and others. And it also becomes directed at the sort of social and political sphere. So as some of her interlocutors say, as some of those that are interviewed in this book will attest, in many cases, when they think of poets like Maulana and Hafez, they would say that these poets do not belong to the past, but they're eternal interlocutors, right? So they're sort of always there as partners in conversation, and remain sort of very much a part of their thoughts and their ways of approaching and interpreting the world around them. And then specifically, when it comes to how this then relates to the authorities, how it relates to the Islamic regime that has continued to be in power, and that has, as we all know, continued to impose these very strict norms, these forms of gender inequality and everything that we have seen courageously contested, especially in the past few months. All of these things are sort of captured by, and by the way, this book is from, I think, at least a couple of years ago, but it's very, I think, prescient, and tells us a lot about what has been happening sort of below the surface, and sometimes not so much below the surface, but that has been happening over time in Iran, which is that through these kinds of, women, for instance, in these poetry groups coming together, there's this growing sense of dissent, and this growing ability to express a kind of rebelliousness, and being unwilling to accept the norms that the regime wants to impose on the population. So this is, again, and I'll maybe just end on this note because I don't want to go over time. So just to end on this point about one of the quotes that I think really highlights and draws attention to how poetry can inspire this sort of spirit of rebelliousness. One of the interviewees in this book, given, of course, her name has been changed to protect her identity, but this woman by the name of Parveen says, we say that Islam and Muslim mean that one must have a head bowed in submission. So again, there's that reference to, Sada Taslim, which is the same thing that Hafez was referring to earlier in his poem. But she says, if we want to submit, then how can we ask questions, and how can we learn? Are we just to say yes, right, to whatever they tell us is our true religion? And the answer that she gives to this, of course, is no, I don't think so. And of course, I don't need to say that we all know quite well just how much these kinds of expressions have really come to the fore, again, have been very courageously expressed, not just going back to, September of last year, but of course, for several years, practically for decades, these forms of resistance have continued to be there, and remain a very sort of crucial part of trying to bring about a more tolerant, potentially a kind of democratic regime, depending on the direction that those in Iran want to take it in. But what I've hoped to draw at least some attention to is the potential significance of poetry like that of Hafez, and how it is part of what can and maybe potentially does inform these these forms of resistance, and the role that it plays in bringing about that sense of agency in ordinary people, believing that they can change the status quo, and that they don't have to just remain submissive and just accept the situation for what it is. And so I think there's a lot in Hafez's poetry that potentially allows for that, and that we can maybe continue to make some of these connections and to identify those points. And so lastly, this is to, again, to kind of juxtapose and to maybe contrast it with other possible interpretations of Hafez. In this case, because of the familiarity and the depth of engagement, we might say that there are certain contexts in which people can more deeply appreciate the kind of message that Hafez has been putting forward, and maybe appreciating it on those terms can help us to better understand the actual transformative potentiality that poems like his may have, and the potential political significance that they may also carry. So on that note, again, I'll stop there. And again, very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and some reflections on this and questions. And yeah, thank you so much for listening and for being a part of this conversation. Thank you, and I'll be happy to. So just to confirm, you're asking there about Edward Said's traveling theory as an idea, as an approach, of course. Yeah, so this set of ideas put forward by Said is of course, by the way, I completely understand about the cat. That's happened to me many times. So Said's ideas, if we look at it within the sort of larger picture of his approach to the study of texts, so aside from some of the things that he's, I think, very well known for in his ideas of Orientalism and so on, this aspect of Said's thought, I think, is relatively, like, again, compared to Orientalism, it's not as well known, I would say. However, I think it is especially useful when it comes to approaching non-Western texts in particular. So, so much of Said's work is about trying to break down certain boundaries that have been constructed, certain hierarchies that have remained sort of dominant, largely as a result of colonialism and imperialism. So there are all of these potential sort of obstacles to understanding others, to engaging in dialogue and in conversation with, for instance, members of other cultures or texts and ideas produced by other cultures. So if we were to look at it in the framework of the ideas that he develops in other works, for instance, in culture and imperialism, his idea of counterpoint. So he had this, I think, really beautifully developed idea that just like the sort of theory of counterpoint in music, there's this possibility of thinking in those kinds of terms where you're able to, in a sense, move back and forth between two potentially very different sorts of positions, right? So on the one hand, thinking about the experience on sort of one side of what he called the imperial divide, compared to thinking from a perspective on the other side. And the idea of the counterpoint that he expresses is that it's meant to be sort of anti-hierarchical. It's supposed to detach us as far as possible from thinking in terms of hierarchies and thinking of some cultures as supposedly being superior to others and so on. So it's within that framework that I think his traveling theory is potentially very useful, because when he provides us with these ways to try to engage in conversation and dialogue with other cultures, we need to be able to appreciate as much as possible the context and the things that give expression to and that give meaning to the lives of others in cultures that may be quite different from our own. And the main benefit, I would say, to his notion of traveling theory is that it really calls attention to, again, that so-called point of origin, and where are the ideas coming from? What were those who came up with these ideas? What were they trying to do when they produced them, and so on? Really attuning us to that, right? It is, of course, important, as you also mentioned, like what are the potential drawbacks to this? I think one of the, you might say, critiques of Said's approach is that some may consider it to be quite taxing and difficult, because it really calls for a certain kind of attentiveness and an immersion into ideas that may be different, quite different from the ones that we're familiar or comfortable with. And so, when he calls on us to try to think contrapuntally, as he puts it, right, to think in terms of that kind of counterpoint, that can kind of take a toll for many people, and it may not be something that everybody necessarily feels up to, right? So if you were to invite someone who, for instance, knows nothing about Hafez, and to tell them, well, if you really want to understand Hafez, you have to go and read all of these things about Iranian history, the background of Iranian poetry, et cetera, to really immerse yourself in that world, and then you'll have sort of a better understanding of it. Well, maybe not everybody will necessarily be up to that, right? Because it really does require a lot of work. So these are sort of some of the possible drawbacks to it, right? But I mean, in my personal point of view, I think it's very much worth it. And in a sense, if we really want to try to understand, for instance, some of the underappreciated meanings of, say, like Hafez's poetry, that's the kind of work that it requires, right? But it's just a question of who is willing to really undertake that work. Okay, now I understand better. Thanks. So I think that is a genuine and important concern to bring up, right? So I do think that Said's traveling theory is actually still attuned to. So it's not just purely focusing on the idea itself, but actually, to go back to the examples that he gives when he talks about the possible sort of pressures and the acceptances and the resistances that can be a part of the way that an idea travels. What he's actually referring to there are precisely the things that you point to. So the impact, for instance, of institutions, of policies, of the political regime in which an idea might, travel through. All of these things are considered as part of the background, right? So in a sense, he's focusing on the theory, right? But he's always considering it in relation to the changes that come about in the theory once it is exposed to these various pressures, again, that as he calls it. And so it's also there in when he talks about the point of origin, right? So an idea, of course, and this is something that Said was very adamant about. It's a very important part of his work. Ideas don't just come about in a vacuum. Literature, for instance, is not just produced in a vacuum. It's always, in a sense, a product of its time, and is in conversation with the political aspects of the world, with institutions and so on. So in that sense, he, I think, was very much, he brings our attention to that as well. And yeah, I could, of course, go on to say more about it, but that's just sort of as a summary. But in short, I do also, especially if you found it interesting, I highly recommend actually reading it. It's not a very long essay. I mean, you might look at both Traveling Theory and Traveling Theory Reconsidered, because he sort of updated some of his ideas. But, you know, they're both fairly, I think they're very interesting and potentially, you know, informative text. So I do recommend reading them if you get a chance. So maybe to take them in turn. So on the first one, actually, I see some relation between the questions as well. So the first one about the different aspects of the aesthetic experience in Hafez, right? So yeah, I drew attention to the different sort of forms that are involved in that, including the embodied aspects of it, but also the sort of physical form of the way that poetry may be presented to us. There's this really interesting idea put forward by Hannah Arendt about it's sort of her take on poetry. So she says in the Human Condition that poetry is actually closest to thought as an art form. And what she goes on to say about this is that you know, what she elaborates is because poetry has this special quality of being memorized and recited, because it is something that very much becomes a part of you in a sense when you recite it. There's this kind of sense of direct connection. And this is something that, for instance, you know, those studying the kinds of effects that Hafez's poetry might, for instance, have, according to the sort of self-expression of those who read and recite his poems. You know, many would say that when you take part in this act of reciting poetry, it's embodied in the sense that you've kind of internalized it. And it's almost like when you speak the poet's words, when you're reading Hafez's poetry, they're coming out of your mouth, but you almost feel as if you're kind of a vehicle for the thoughts of someone else, for the poems of someone else. And so there's that sense of connectedness, right? That sense of connection that you might feel to someone who is from a very different time and place, right? He's from many centuries ago, and yet he somehow speaks across time and through you when you recite his poetry. So that's part of the embodied aspect that I think is really significant. And this is the part that I would relate to the possibilities for political emancipation. Now, this is, of course, it comes with some caveats. It's not so straightforward. It's not like, okay, like you read Hafez and you become a revolutionary or you become a dissident. It works, I think, in a much more subtle way, which you know, I think still needs more work and sort of scholarship to really flesh this out. But what I really would emphasize in the approach that I've taken toward this kind of interpretation is there's a process through which, when you engage with, for instance, poems like those of Hafez, there's the possibility for a certain kind of awakening to take place, right? So you can read his poems when you appreciate maybe the possible political dimension and that aspect of resistance to what he's saying. When you look at how he kind of sometimes, you know, directly addresses you and tries to incite you to go and to act a certain way in the world. These are certain forms of what I think can be called the initial form of a kind of democratic agency, where he gives the possibility to his readers to see themselves as agents, not just as passive recipients of other people's ideas, right? So again, when he writes against the sort of, you know, the powers that be and the religious and the political authorities, he's directly challenging them, right? And he's saying that I don't accept these limitations on my freedom. I don't accept these views of these interpretations of Islam. And against that, right, he asserts for himself, and he also tells his readers that you can think for yourself, right? You can live a different way. You don't have to live like this. So in short, when all of that becomes internalized, when you have the possibility of thinking that way, you come to see yourself more as an agent, as someone who is capable of bringing about change. And then when this then becomes a communal effort, right? So not just through the example of like the women's poetry groups, but when it spreads more and more across society, and you have a much larger group of people coming to see themselves as agents, that, you know, they have the possibility of bringing about a certain form of emancipation, then this spreads across society, and it creates the possibilities for a much more, a larger, potentially transformative social movement, right? So again, this is not to say sort of simplistically that like Hafez, the aesthetic experience of reading Hafez like directly leads to that, but I think there are certain underlying elements, right? And it's one of the sources that we can identify for these this kind of growth of these feelings of democratic agency. So that in turn, now just to maybe quickly tie that into your second question, the sort of the political dimensions of this. And so I guess the way that you put it is, what conception of politics helps us to see aesthetic experience as important, if I have that right? So the possibility here that I think we might be able to trace in the connection between aesthetics and politics here, one maybe useful frame for thinking about this, again, going back to one thinker that I mentioned along the way, Jacques Rancière's ideas. So thinking about, and he's, you know, written quite a bit about the connections between aesthetics and politics. But one of the most, I think, promising aspects of what he writes about, and what is potentially can link this notion of democratic agency to political movements, and especially to like rebellion and dissidence, is that aesthetic expressions, works of art, our possible uses of art, can serve to have a kind of disruptive function, right? Works of art tend to intervene in the kinds of norms that may be handed down by a political regime. And so, you know, as Rancière points out, this is something that has happened for centuries, for example, in Western philosophy, in this kind of tension between these sort of totalizing theories going as far back as Plato and his sort of ban on poets and certain forms of poetry in his Republic, and the various challenges by artists, writers and poets and others across time to speak back against that, right? And to say that we don't have to accept these kinds of rigid norms. And so one way of looking at art is essentially as a potential source of resistance, of intervention, right, of disagreement. And so this is something that is already sort of there within many different forms of art. And I think, as you, I tend to really agree that this has been underappreciated when it comes to sort of non-Western context, because so much has been written about those aspects of resistance in art, in sort of Western philosophy and in Western political theory, but much less has been said about, you know, how these things can function in non-Western societies, and how it's potentially useful to look at these other contexts and to see how art is used as a means of resistance in those cases. So yeah, so I appreciated your questions and sort of bringing more attention to that. So this is a great question, and it's one that I've thought a lot about, and I have continued to think about, and I'd be curious to hear other thoughts on this as well, and to see what your perspectives would be on this. The way that I approach and understand it is through the kind of lens of the other ideas that Hafez is also sort of cognizant of and engaging with, because even if he doesn't sit so comfortably within that position of like a Sufi poet, despite that, there are of course a lot of themes of Sufism in his poetry, right? And Hafez, of course, knew about and was in many ways kind of extending the conversation that had begun with earlier sort of Sufi poets. And one of the main ones that I think are really crucial and that I go back to would be the example set by Maulana, because in his poems, for instance, in his Masnavi, he talks a lot about, and Maulana was compared to Hafez, he was more of a sort of, initially he was like a trained theologian, right? And so he was very familiar with the sort of scientific implications of the ideas of knowledge in relation to religion and so on. And the conception that Maulana seemed to have been really sort of engaged with was the idea of knowledge as ilm, right? Which is, of course, a very sort of common usage, but it has a lot of different connotations. There's a lot of implications there, right? So throughout a lot of these debates that began after the introduction of Islamic thought into the sort of milieu of thinkers and poets like Maulana and Hafez, that notion of ilm was packed in many ways with a potential sort of scientific meaning, right? So like ilm as a kind of science, but also with a religious significance, because according to certain interpreters of what constituted sort of proper knowledge, or even a theological sort of knowledge, according to some schools of thought. So there was, the Hanafi school, for instance, which Maulana was very much in conversation with. The idea of ilm referred to a certain kind of scholarly knowledge that came through, for instance, interpretation of the Quran, and the ability to, correctly read it, to have this authoritative understanding and so on, and everything that was involved in that according to, Islamic jurists at the time, right? So in the context of all this, when you have someone like Maulana come along and challenge the potential meanings and the potential connotations of ilm, because in so many of his poems, including in his Divan Shams, when he's writing about Shams Tabrizi, he really reorients this idea of ilm to that of, he talks about the ilm of lovers, right? This knowledge that is born in and through the experience of that kind of relationality that comes from this kind of communal experience that individuals can have with one another, in the same way that he had those connections with Shams Tabrizi. And so in that way, these kinds of predecessors like Maulana, they help to really solidify this idea that we can think of ilm in a different way. It doesn't come down to just scholarly knowledge, right? Or in the realm of just like science and theology, but that it's a very sort of potentially personal and lived experience. And so the way that I interpret Hafez, I see him picking up on that thread. So when he's talking about knowledge, it's not just a certain kind of like divine knowledge in the ways that theologians would talk about it, but rather a knowledge that you get from these sort of communal bonds, right? All of the things that come with, drinking wine, being among friends, etc. All of the things that are really crucial to sort of Hafez's ethos and his sort of understanding, right? So in that sense, it's kind of continuing to challenge the idea of what knowledge should be. and what actually constitutes knowledge. So yeah, sorry, hopefully that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but hopefully it covered some aspects of what you were asking about. I mean, at times he's actually quite clear in who he's targeting, right? So at the beginning of that poem, he mentions like the zahid, right? The person who's like the ascetic, the one who insists on being sort of living this very sort of pious lifestyle. Yeah, it has to be how everybody lives. And so, right, so when Hafez is challenging that, absolutely, it's a certain challenge to religious claims to knowledge and so on. I really take a much more sort of humble approach in my research and try to have some epistemic humility on this, because it's far from, you know, it's of course it's not an exact science by any means, right? For us to have any claims to a kind of more like a pure interpretation or even the possibility of that, right? This excellent question allows me to maybe elaborate on just more of the complexities that are involved as you're drawing attention to it, right? So there's kind of some layers to your question there, right? So to take them in turn, that the significance of interpretation, right? Maybe if it's helpful, I can say a bit more about the significance of hermeneutics as I see it, as being an important part of this, right? So, you know, according to the hermeneutic tradition, and there are of course different sort of variants of this over time and things that get added to it. But if we go back, for instance, to Gadamer, right? There's this way in which, when we think about what it even means to interpret a text or you know, a speech or anything that is sort of given to us to be understood, there's a real difficulty in reaching a kind of exact comprehension, right? And that's part of the sort of epistemological component of what Gadamer draws attention to, which is that in a sense, because of the things that you always bring with you into an experience, and for instance, into a text, it's very difficult for you to be able to say, like, this is exactly what the text means, because the text can mean something different to you because of the life world that you're bringing into that, right? And your life experiences. It can mean something very different to someone else based on what they bring into the text. Despite that, several, you know, thinkers in this sort of tradition and this line of thinking and hermeneutics have gone on to argue that it's possible for us to at least mitigate misunderstanding as much as possible. So through the kinds of ideas that are added to this tradition by Charles Taylor and his use of hermeneutics. And I would especially highlight Paul Ricoeur, who I think is especially helpful in advancing these ideas and adding, you know, taking into account these layers of complexity involved in the process of interpretation. What these thinkers, I think, provide us with as tools to better understand how we can mitigate or reduce as far as possible misunderstandings that may occur. There's so, for instance, according to Ricoeur in Time and Narrative and in other texts where he talks about the process of interpretation, Ricoeur talks about it in terms of what he calls mimesis, right? Which is it's a form of representation, right? Where you're trying to sort of, in a sense, there's a process of mimicry that is involved in understanding, right? So he identifies the hermeneutic process as being kind of a threefold stage of mimesis. So there's the first point of mimesis, which is, again, that kind of what you're bringing into a text. There's the second moment of mimesis, which is the immersion into the text, where to speak figuratively, you sort of swim around in the text and you try to understand what it's giving you, right? What it's trying to provide to your understanding, like how you can comprehend it. And then in the third moment of mimesis, there's a certain kind of a so-called transformation that takes place, right? What is also discussed as a so-called fusion of horizons, which is sort of Charles Taylor's preferred term. So according to theorists of hermeneutics, what happens throughout this process is you may have your understanding transformed, right? There's a possibility for you to come out of that experience with a new understanding and possibly a new kind of knowledge, right? But all of this is still quite contingent. It's not just a given, right? It really depends a lot on the depth of immersion and on the sort of attentiveness that you bring into that experience, right? Because one might just sort of casually read a text or a poem, right? You might just casually look over something that Hafez has written. But if you don't bring that kind of deeper immersion, if you don't really try to, again, dive deeply into what he might be saying, right? It's going to be very difficult for you to have a kind of, deeper understanding. So that's one of the sort of real difficulties involved with hermeneutics. It really involves, it requires of us a kind of willingness to dive deeper, so to speak, right? Now to connect this to the other part of the question about, what can we say about, for instance, if we want to identify whether Hafez is actually being critical or not, or what is he potentially giving us to understand. So if we want to try to, again, mitigate misunderstanding, we can at least begin by drawing a line between what is a potentially kind of acceptable interpretation or a tenable interpretation compared to one that is just untenable and just makes no sense, right? So if we were to read Hafez and say like, oh, okay, well, Hafez is clearly a Buddhist, and the message that he's giving us is that we should all become adherents of Buddhism, right? Okay, we can make that claim. We can say initially, we might say that, okay, that might be a valid interpretation. But then if you look at what he's saying, right, maybe, and on some level, there are some aspects of Buddhism, if you look really deeply into the history of Sufism, there might be some aspects of Buddhism that kind of, sneak in there and that are sort of, that were part of the formative period of Sufi thought and so on, and that maybe there's traces of that in Hafez's thought. But to claim that Hafez was a Buddhist and that what he's giving us in his poetry is a call for us to also become Buddhists, it would be practically untenable, right? That would be a kind of misinterpretation. It would be an interpretation that is clearly misunderstanding, right, his text. Whereas if we're looking for something like, well, is Hafez being critical? Is there a kind of dissident tone to Hafez's poetry? Is he giving us something that is potentially a critique of the political authorities? Maybe, connecting this to Arsalan's question earlier, right? If we look at what he says about so-called knowledge pretenders, when he uses specific terms to, single out like ascetics and preachers and so on, and when he's clearly critiquing their ideas, right? And he's saying that I don't want to live like you, or I don't accept the lifestyle that you want to impose on me. I want to continue to be, rendi. When he says these kinds of things, well, we can interpret him, right? I think with fairly confidently and accurately as being more of like a dissident, right? Or that he's putting forward a certain form of resistance. And that this is in line with, his sort of being steeped in Sufism and being steeped in the Persianate sort of literary tradition and all of these things, right? So those would all be, I think, valid interpretations. compared to other kinds of interpretations that could be considered just completely misunderstanding him or completely untenable. So in short, and again, sorry if the answers are going for too long, but because I think it's a really great question that you've asked, and it requires a kind of deeper thinking about this, right? But in short, I think that when we take this kind of hermeneutic approach and when we use these theories and these tools, it can be helpful to try to parse out, what is an acceptable sort of interpretation, and how can we sort of mitigate possible misunderstandings which are involved in this kind of, the complexities of these epistemological questions. So. So this is a great question. Thank you. And I think, so absolutely, we have to remain aware of the potential limitations. And so I wouldn't want to overstate, for instance, Hafez's potential and his usefulness as being like, like one of the main poets or thinkers that we should look to for this, right? Part of what I'm sort of hoping to do in this longer project and in thinking about these sort of aesthetic forms of expression in non-Western thought more widely is, of course, to tie these to more contemporary or recent thinkers, relatively recent artists and poets and others. But the idea is to not think of them as being in any sense kind of mutually exclusive, right? So it's not to say that, just like Hafez somehow matters more, or that contemporary poets and thinkers matters more, but rather kind of seeing the possible continuities between them and drawing on as many resources as possible, right? Part of the reason I'm really kind of taking Hafez alongside Rumi, for example, as a kind of starting point, is that just as in the Western tradition, right? For instance, in the history of political thought, there's a tendency, and I think it makes good sense, to try to have a certain set of ideas as a kind of canon that you draw upon, right? So, the Western tradition of political thought really values the Western canon, right? And so even in thinking about contemporary politics, a lot of political theorists always go back to, these really sort of seminal figures in the Western canon and in that tradition, right? In some cases, as far back as like antiquity, which is why practically, anytime you, undergraduates in political science, when they take a course in political theory, it almost always starts with Plato and Aristotle, and then considers like the so-called greats of the Western canon. So in short, I personally think that we need to do more of this work of providing a kind of space for these other potentially canonical figures in non-Western traditions like that of Iran, because I think there's a wealth of resources there that we can draw on, right? So just as when, again, contemporary thinkers in political theory, when they draw on a set of ideas to speak to the present, to bring to bear on political problems in the present, a lot of times they use thinkers from the distant past as well. And so I think that we can also do that in the case of thinkers like Maulana and Hafez and others, but that we just have to continue to fill this kind of gap that has existed, right? And create the possibility for those kinds of connections to be able to draw on that as a resource. But again, the work that I think should work in tandem with this, right? Again, as a kind of continuity, is to then tie that to even more direct sources of potentially democratic thinking, right? And I would make the case that we have plenty of thinkers in the 20th century up until the present who also do this kind of work, right? And there's a wealth of poets and artists and thinkers and philosophers that we can draw on to do that kind of work. But that, again, this is sort of meant to be sort of alongside earlier writers and thinkers like Hafez. So what this then, as a sort of larger project, right, this can all sort of potentially contribute to providing a set of resources that we can then use toward democratic thinking, toward these resources that can continue to build on that sense of democratic agency in this kind of more sort of you might call it a kind of homegrown set of ideas, right, and traditions that can then sort of be combined with insights from, for instance, from the Western experience. But as is the case for so many living and growing up with these ideas in Iran, I think it's potentially, it's especially valuable for them to be able to draw on our own traditions, our own sort of, really deep pool of resources to be able to put forward these ideas and to really reinforce and strengthen these ideas of democratic agency. But all of that, again, I think involves the continual development and the building of a kind of canon of ideas so that we have something to draw on. So I hope that answers the question as to why I sort of start with Hafez and would see him as being valuable in that sense. Yeah, so this is a great question. So actually, that quote of poets like Hafez and Maulana not belonging to the past, but being so-called eternal interlocutors. So that's a phrase in Niloufar Hayari's work, and she's actually in turn she's quoting Dariush Shayegan, and so it's meant to give a kind of expression to what thinkers like Shayegan would insist is an important part of the sort of Iranian imaginary. And it also is a kind of testament to a lot of the sort of self-expressions of those who continue to live with and to recite his poetry. They say, that it has this kind of almost eternal quality to it because there's, according to his sort of proponents, the people who still sort of love his poetry, there's a sense of connectedness, right? So there's a way in which they would say that when you read Hafez's poetry, even if he is from several centuries ago, there's this tone of still somehow being present or still being relevant, right, to our lives today. There's also the added, and this is sort of based on a sort of personal experience, and maybe this is, of course, not the case for everyone, but I do think it's the case for many of us, or for many Iranians. So like if you're like born, and even if you spent, like I only spent up until my 8th year of life in Iran, right? So I was 8 years old when we left, and yet it's still, when I go back to my childhood and being brought up and like, my mother sort of reading Hafez's poems to me, those moments of actually like learning to memorize it and to recite it and those things, it really stays with you, right? If you have those experiences and if they turn out to be kind of formative. And so they kind of accompany you in a sense through life. It's possible to drift away from that, right? And to not necessarily give it the same kind of weight and significance. But when it's an especially sort of formative and early experience, it's the kind of thing that can really stay with you, right? And I would say, in response to your question of like why Hafez in particular, of course, it's not just Hafez. Say in your case, you have a preference for Furul and her poems, and that may be the case for many as well, right? But I guess a lot of it has to do with that kind of exposure and to what extent it's considered sort of valuable by, for example, your family members, or even like, you know, the school that you went to, because it still tends to be a part of like the curriculum, right? For many young Iranians, right? You even in sort of elementary school or in high school, you're being exposed to, you're reading those poems. So in those ways, it has a certain staying power, right? It has the potential to stay with you. Not to mention the many other facets of, like, you know, just rituals and things that we continue to keep alive, like Father Hafez, obviously, and all of these kinds of things. It plays into that, right? It kind of keeps the spirit of his thinking and of his poetry alive in many of us. So I would say those are just among some of the things that contribute, not necessarily for everybody, but maybe for many Iranians, it continues to resonate, and it's part of why Hafez remains relevant. But finally, I do want to say, though, that it is a kind of task. It's a kind of imperative in a way to try to keep that alive, right? Because it requires a certain kind of intentionality as well, right? There's all of those kind of unconscious aspects to it, but there's a way in which, you know, if we come to identify the significance of what Hafez may be providing for us, and if we think that that's really valuable, we want to keep it alive, and we want to, you know, continue to talk about the possible significance that his ideas may have on the present and so on, then that's another sort of possible driving force between in you know, in keeping those ideas alive and tying some of those ideas to our conceptions of politics and all of this. So yeah, so it's just, in short, it's kind of maybe it's a complex process, right? Some of it is maybe unconscious, and some of it is through a conscious effort to keep those ideas in our conversations. In short, really appreciate it, and really look forward to, you know, more conversations down the line. So thank you.